London's East End after the war was a place where certainty had quietly collapsed. Bomb sites still scarred the streets, rationing had only recently ended, and for many families, survival remained a daily calculation rather than a moral choice. In these narrow roads and crowded flats, people learned early that rules written far away did not always make sense on the ground. And as the city tried to rebuild itself, another, quieter transformation was already underway, one that would decide who truly held power. Yet almost no one noticed it happening until it was far too late. Right and wrong in the East End were no longer opposites, they were points on a sliding scale. Late-night drinking after licensed hours, card games played behind locked doors, informal betting rings operating in back rooms, these were not seen as crimes, but as ordinary life. Police raids came often, sometimes violent, rarely respected. Arrests felt arbitrary, justice felt distant. Over time, law enforcement stopped being viewed as protection and started being treated as intrusion. And when that trust eroded, something else began to fill the gap, something unofficial, familiar, and far more personal. Communities adapted the way communities always do under pressure, by closing ranks. Serious crimes went unreported, witnesses disappeared. Silence became a survival skill passed down like street knowledge. People did not believe the police could help them, and worse, many believed that asking for help would only make things worse. This was not rebellion, it was resignation. A shared understanding that the state did not truly belong in their lives and therefore, neither did its laws. It was into this moral gray zone that Ronnie and Reggie Kray stepped. They did not arrive as monsters, nor as visionaries. They arrived as locals, boys who understood the streets, the codes, the unspoken rules. They saw clearly what others had merely endured. When official authority is rejected, another form of authority will inevitably rise in its place. And they were ready to become it, but at this stage, they were still only observers watching, learning, waiting for the right moment to move. What made the Krays dangerous was not ambition alone, but comprehension. They understood that power in the East End would not come from money at first, nor even from violence, but from credibility. From knowing who owed whom, from understanding which crimes were tolerated and which crossed invisible lines. They saw that respect no longer flowed upward toward institutions, but sideways toward those who could solve problems quickly and decisively. And they knew that once people depended on you, they would defend you, even against the law. By the time the wider world began to hear their names, the groundwork had already been laid. The East End was primed for rulers who spoke its language and played by its rules. And the twins had something else, something rarer than muscle or money, a sense of inevitability. They did not ask whether they should take control, only how. What no one yet realized was how thoroughly that control would reshape daily life, and how costly it would be to challenge it later. As you listen, remember stories like this don't survive unless people choose to hear them. If you find yourself drawn into this hidden history, subscribing and liking the video helps ensure these stories reach others who might otherwise never encounter them. And in the case of the Krays, what people didn't see was often as powerful as what they did. Because while London slept and the East End looked away, a new law was already forming, one enforced not by courts or uniforms, but by fear, loyalty, and reputation. And once that law took hold, removing it would prove far more difficult than anyone imagined. Power in the East End did not announce itself with speeches or banners. It arrived quietly, then all at once. By the time most people realized that the Kray twins were in control, daily life had already adjusted around them. Decisions were being made elsewhere now, enforced not by paperwork or patrols, but by reputation. And reputation, once established, moved faster than any police car ever could, especially when it was backed by violence that people had learned not to question. The Krays ruled decisively, and they ruled visibly. Violence was not something they hid, it was something they displayed with purpose. At the slightest challenge, they responded swiftly, sometimes publicly, sometimes in ways that traveled through rumor alone. Men were beaten, others were sent to hospital. The message was never complicated. Resistance would be remembered. Fear was not a side effect of their rule, it was the foundation of it. And fear, when applied consistently, created a peculiar kind of order. Soon, nothing happened in the East End without their knowledge. Publicans, club owners, and backroom operators began approaching the twins voluntarily. Not because a threat had been made, but because experience had taught them something brutal and practical. It was cheaper to be protected by the Krays than preyed upon by everyone else. Lesser criminals, uncontrolled and unpredictable, posed constant risks. The twins offered something different: certainty. And certainty in a fractured society was valuable enough to pay for. Their protection racket followed a ruthless logic. Only those already breaking the law could be exploited. Anyone operating legitimately could call the police. But those selling alcohol after hours, hosting illegal gambling, or running unlicensed clubs had no such option. For them, the choice was simple: pay for protection or face endless harassment, theft, and violence. Refusal was rare, and when it happened, it was handled methodically. First intimidation, then assault, then complete ruin. And each punishment was carefully observed by others who understood the lesson being taught. What made the Krays especially dangerous was what they did not do. They avoided direct robberies. That, they believed, was jailbird work. Instead, they positioned themselves above the crime itself, taking their share from the criminals below them. They taxed illegality rather than participating in it. This kept their hands clean enough to move freely, while still benefiting from every unlawful act carried out in their territory. It was not recklessness, it was strategy. This was not chaos, it was organized power, operating with its own rules and internal discipline. Loyalty was enforced not just through fear, but through ritual and identity. Their men knew exactly where they stood. Disobedience was punished. Obedience was rewarded with protection and status. The twins were not merely feared, they were obeyed. And as obedience spread, it began to feel permanent, like a fact of life rather than a criminal arrangement. Yet beneath this carefully maintained order lay a dangerous truth. Systems built on fear are only as strong as the illusion of control that sustains them. Every beating, every whispered warning, every hospital visit added weight but also pressure. And pressure, over time, demands release. The question was not whether the Krays empire would be tested, but where the first crack would appear. And who would be standing closest when it did? Because even the most disciplined criminal order carries a flaw at its center. And in the case of the Krays, that flaw was not external opposition, but something far closer to home. Power built on fear can dominate a street, but to endure, it must learn to smile. The Kray twins understood this instinctively. Violence could silence opposition, but it could not explain their presence to the wider world. And so, as their control of the East End solidified, another project began quietly alongside it: the construction of legitimacy. What the public saw would no longer be fists and whispers, but charm, generosity, and carefully staged respectability. Yet behind that polished surface, something unstable was already beginning to shift. The twins cultivated an image with remarkable discipline. Charity events were organized. Donations were made publicly, cameras flashing as money changed hands. They attended social functions, dressed impeccably, speaking politely, never appearing rushed or aggressive. In their clubs, business was never conducted openly. Women were treated with courtesy. Swearing in front of mothers or aunts was forbidden. This was not accidental behavior, it was theater, performed nightly for anyone watching, and many were watching. Fleet Street took notice. Newspapers began to portray Ronnie and Reggie not as criminals, but as local characters, hard men, perhaps, but principled ones. To some, they appeared almost gallant, protectors of their community. Men who enforced order where the state had failed. The contradiction was striking: in private, terror. In public, admiration, and for a time, the balance held. But not everyone was convinced. Crime reporter Norman Lucas watched closely. He noticed the moments others missed, the whispered conversations at the far end of the bar, the sudden silences when certain men entered a room, the private meetings that took place just out of sight. The charm, he suspected, was a mask, and behind it lay something far more dangerous than ordinary criminality. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. The Kray's greatest defense was that nothing ever seemed provable. Not yet. Then came the instability, the first undeniable rupture in the illusion. In 1958, Ronnie Kray carried out a violent bayonet attack so severe that it could no longer be contained or explained away. Authorities intervened, and Ronnie was committed to a mental hospital. For the first time, the twins were separated. And for the first time, the system they had built faced uncertainty. The East End watched closely, unsure whether this was the beginning of an end or merely a pause. What followed bordered on the surreal. Through confusion, manipulation, and the twins' near-identical appearance, identities were blurred. Reggie walked free. Ronnie, supposedly confined, became a fugitive. Authority was deceived. Procedures failed. Even those tasked with reporting the truth found themselves pulled into the distortion. Norman Lucas, briefly, became an unwilling participant in a world where nothing was quite what it seemed. The mask had slipped, but only for those close enough to notice. Behind the spectacle and public generosity lay fragility. The empire depended not just on fear, but on the careful management of perception. And perception, once damaged, is difficult to repair. Ronnie's instability introduced unpredictability, the one thing their system could not tolerate. Violence without control threatened everything. The very traits that had built their power now risked exposing its limits. If this story has you leaning closer, it's because history like this often hides in plain sight. Subscribing and liking the video helps ensure these deeper stories where image and reality collide reach people who might never question the surface. And in the case of the Krays, the surface was about to crack completely. Because once respectability begins to fail, fear alone is not enough. And as the twins struggled to maintain their illusion, forces beyond their control were finally beginning to move. What had once been untouchable was now being watched. And the silence that protected them for so long was starting to weaken. By the early 1960s, the cost of the Krays' rule was no longer abstract. It could be seen in shuttered shops, in men who limped through the streets with eyes fixed on the pavement, in businesses that operated only by permission. The twins' influence had expanded far beyond protection. It had become domination. And domination, when sustained long enough, leaves scars that even fear can no longer fully conceal. Still, few dared to speak. Silence remained the strongest currency in the East End until it began to fail. Violence intensified, threats became routine. Beatings were delivered with a sense of inevitability rather than rage. In one case, a man's entire livelihood was burned to the ground, an unmistakable warning to anyone considering resistance. Victims did, at times, go to the police. Arrests were even made. But almost without exception, testimony vanished as quickly as it appeared. Statements were withdrawn, memories faded. Witnesses suddenly refused to cooperate, fear proved stronger than relief, and the system stalled again and again. What made this cycle so effective was not just intimidation, but psychology. The Krays had taught their victims that seeking help would only deepen their suffering. Protection from the twins might be brutal, but it was predictable. Intervention from the law felt uncertain and dangerously visible. Many chose the devil they knew. And so the empire endured, not because it was universally loved, but because it felt inescapable. By July 1964, Scotland Yard could no longer ignore the scale of the damage. A special squad was established with one purpose: dismantle the Kray organization completely. Officers focused relentlessly, gathering fragments of evidence, revisiting old cases, pressuring known associates. Yet progress was slow, files were thin, cooperation was minimal. The silence that had protected the twins for years still held just barely. And everyone involved understood that if it held much longer, it might never break. Then came moments that revealed the true depth of terror. In one case, a woman was finally rescued from the Kray's control. Safe at last, removed from immediate danger, she collapsed to her knees not in fear, but in gratitude. Only then did investigators fully grasp what had kept her silent for so long. This was not mere intimidation, it was psychological imprisonment. The Krays had not simply threatened lives. They had reshaped how people understood safety itself. The twins had ruled through more than violence. They ruled through the absence of trust in institutions, the absence of faith in justice, and the absence of belief that the law belonged to ordinary people. Their power thrived in that vacuum, but vacuums attract attention. And once the state committed itself fully, once silence began to fracture in small, irreversible ways, the limits of fear became visible. The Krays were not invincible, they had never been. Their dominance depended on a delicate balance: fear without chaos, respectability without scrutiny, silence without collapse. When those elements slipped out of alignment, the system they had built began to turn against them. Control, once absolute, became fragile, and fragility, once exposed, spreads quickly. Their story is not simply one of criminal twins rising and falling. It is a warning about what emerges when law loses legitimacy, when communities feel abandoned, and when power learns to disguise itself as protection. The Krays did not create the conditions that allowed them to rule, they exploited them. And in doing so, they revealed how thin the line can be between order and terror. In the end, their greatest weapon was not violence, nor charm, nor reputation, it was silence. And once that silence began to break, everything they had built was already standing on borrowed time.